Sarah McLeod received the telegram about her husband's death on the same day she discovered she was pregnant. Now she had to choose: grieve for the man she lost or fight for the child he'd never meet. It was December 15th, 1915, when Sarah Elizabeth McLeod's world changed forever. She had woken that morning feeling queasy, a sensation that had been troubling her for weeks. At 23, she was young enough to dismiss it as worry about Jack, her husband of barely a year, who was fighting somewhere on the Gallipoli Peninsula. The morning had started like any other wartime day in their small house in Paddington. Sarah had prepared for her work at the local school, where she taught children whose fathers were also fighting overseas. She had written her daily letter to Jack, full of cheerful news about the neighborhood and careful omissions about her growing fears for his safety. But as she walked to the kitchen to make tea, the nausea hit her with such force that she had to grip the door frame to steady herself. And in that moment, with a clarity that cut through her morning fog, Sarah realized what her body had been trying to tell her for weeks. She was pregnant. But before Sarah could fully process this life-changing news, a knock at the door would bring news that would shatter her world and force her to make the most difficult choice of her life. The telegram boy stood on her doorstep, his young face grave with the weight of the message he carried. Sarah's hands trembled as she signed for the yellow envelope, knowing with terrible certainty what it contained. She had seen too many women in her neighborhood receive similar telegrams, had watched too many wives collapse under the weight of those few devastating words. We regret to inform you that Sergeant Jack McLeod was killed in action at Hill 60 on August 7th, 1915. He died serving his country with honor and distinction. Sarah read the words 3 times before their meaning penetrated the shock that had numbed her mind. Jack was dead. Her husband, her best friend, the man who had promised to come home to build a life with her, was buried on a hillside in Turkey. But even as grief threatened to overwhelm her, another realization cut through the pain. She was carrying Jack's child. A child he would never meet, never hold, never teach to walk or read or laugh at his terrible jokes. Standing in her kitchen, one hand pressed to her still flat belly and the other clutching the telegram that had made her a widow, Sarah faced a choice that would define the rest of her life. What Sarah decided in that moment would not only determine her own future, but change the lives of thousands of women who would face the same impossible situation. Sarah could have chosen grief. She could have retreated into the darkness of loss, could have spent her pregnancy mourning the man who would never see his child born. Many women did exactly that, and no one would have blamed her for it. But as Sarah stood in that kitchen feeling the first flutter of life growing inside her, she made a different choice. She chose to fight, not just for herself and not just for the child she carried, but for every woman who would receive a telegram like hers, for every widow who would be left to navigate pregnancy and motherhood alone, for every child who would grow up without a father because their country had called him to war. The first battle came sooner than she expected. 3 days after receiving the telegram, Sarah received a visit from Mrs. Pemberton, a stern woman from the local ladies' auxiliary. who had appointed herself the moral guardian of military wives. Mrs. McLeod, Mrs. Pemberton said, settling herself in Sarah's parlor with the air of someone delivering an unpleasant but necessary lecture. "I understand you're expecting a child." "Yes," Sarah replied, her chin lifting slightly. "Jack's child." "Of course, dear. But you must understand your position now. As a war widow, you'll be receiving a pension from the government. It's not much, but it should be sufficient for a woman living quietly and modestly." What Mrs. Pemberton said next would reveal the true battle that war widows faced. Not just grief, but a society that expected them to disappear. "The thing is, Mrs. McLeod, the pension comes with certain expectations. You'll need to conduct yourself appropriately. No work outside the home, of course. That would be taking employment from men who need it. No socializing with unmarried men, and certainly no political activities or public speaking. The government provides for war widows on the understanding that they will live quietly and gratefully." Sarah stared at the older woman, understanding dawning like a cold sunrise. The pension wasn't support, it was a leash. The government would provide just enough money to keep war widows alive, but only if they agreed to become invisible. "What if I want to work?" Sarah asked. "I'm a trained teacher. I could support myself and my child." Mrs. Pemberton's smile was patronizing. "My dear, no school would hire a war widow. It wouldn't be appropriate. Besides, your duty now is to your child and to your husband's memory. Jack McLeod died a hero. Surely you don't want to dishonor that sacrifice by making a spectacle of yourself." After Mrs. Pemberton left, Sarah sat alone in her parlor, her hand resting on her growing belly, and felt anger kindle in her chest. Jack had died fighting for freedom, for the right of people to live with dignity and choice. How could honoring his memory require her to give up her own freedom? But Sarah's real education in the challenges facing war widows would come when she tried to navigate the bureaucracy that was supposed to help her. The pension office was a gray, cheerless building filled with long queues of women clutching paperwork and children. Sarah joined the line, her pregnancy now visible beneath her black mourning dress, and waited for 3 hours to speak to a clerk who seemed determined to find reasons to deny her claim. "Sergeant McLeod, you said?" The clerk shuffled through papers with deliberate slowness. "Killed at Hill 60. Yes, I see the record here, but there's a problem with your application." "What kind of problem?" Sarah asked. "You were married in February 1914, and your husband enlisted in April 1915. That's over a year. The regulations state that war widows' pensions are only available to women who were married to their husbands for at least 18 months before the husband's enlistment." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. "But we were married for almost 2 years when he died." "Yes, but only 11 months before he enlisted. I'm sorry, Mrs. McLeod, but you don't qualify for the full pension. You'll receive the reduced rate for short-term military wives." The reduced rate was barely enough to pay rent, let alone support a child. Sarah left the pension office with a voucher for £3 a month, and the growing realization that the system designed to help war widows was actually designed to make them disappear. but it was a chance encounter with another war widow that would show Sarah she wasn't alone in this fight, and give her the idea that would change everything. Sarah was walking home from the pension office, her mind reeling from the bureaucratic cruelty she'd just experienced, when she heard crying from a nearby park. Following the sound, she found a young woman sitting on a bench, a toddler playing at her feet while she wept into her hands. "Are you all right?" Sarah asked, sitting beside her. The woman looked up, her face streaked with tears. "I'm sorry. I don't usually. It's just that I don't know what to do anymore." Her name was Margaret Foster, and her husband had been killed at Lone Pine just 2 weeks after Jack's death. She had a 2-year-old son and was pregnant with her second child, but the pension office had denied her claim because she couldn't prove her marriage. The church records had been destroyed in a fire. "They told me to find witnesses," Margaret sobbed, "but everyone who was at our wedding is either dead or fighting overseas. They said without proof of marriage I'm not entitled to anything. They suggested I contact a charity." Sarah felt her anger crystallize into something harder and more focused. Margaret's story wasn't unique. It was the same bureaucratic cruelty that had reduced Sarah's own pension, the same system that seemed designed to punish women for their husband's service. "What if we didn't accept this?" Sarah said suddenly. "What if we fought back?" What Sarah proposed next would seem impossible to most people, but it would become the foundation of a movement that would change Australian society forever. "I used to be a teacher," Sarah continued, her mind racing. "I know how to organize, how to research, how to speak in public. What if we gathered all the war widows we could find and demanded better treatment? What if we made ourselves impossible to ignore?" Margaret stared at her. "They'd never listen to us. We're just women, widows. They expect us to be grateful for whatever scraps they throw us." "That's exactly why they'll have to listen," Sarah replied. "Because we're the widows of heroes. Our husbands died for this country, and this country owes us more than bureaucratic cruelty and starvation wages." Over the following weeks, Sarah began what would become her life's work. She visited every war widow she could find, listening to their stories, documenting the failures of the pension system, and slowly building a network of women who were tired of being invisible. There was Mrs. Chen, whose Chinese-Australian husband had been denied enlistment 3 times before finally being accepted, only to die at Gallipoli, and whose widow was now told she didn't qualify for a pension because of her race. There was Elizabeth Murphy, whose husband had been killed in the first week of fighting, leaving her with 4 children under the age of 10, and a pension that covered less than half their rent. Each story added fuel to Sarah's growing determination. These women had sacrificed everything for their country's war effort, and their country was abandoning them in return. But Sarah's first public speech would nearly end her campaign before it began and teach her a hard lesson about the price of challenging the system. Sarah organized the first meeting of what she called the War Widows Association in the community hall of her local church. She expected maybe a dozen women to attend. Instead, Over 60 widows crowded into the small space, many bringing their children, all carrying stories of bureaucratic neglect and financial desperation. Sarah stood before them, 6 months pregnant and visibly nervous, and spoke from her heart about the choice they all faced: accept invisibility or fight for dignity. "Our husbands died believing they were fighting for freedom and justice," she said. "How can we honor their memory by accepting injustice? How can we teach our children about courage if we don't have the courage to demand what we deserve?" The response was overwhelming. Women who had been isolated in their grief found community and purpose. They began organizing, documenting cases of pension denial, and planning their first public demonstration. But the backlash was swift and vicious. The next morning, Sarah found her front door painted with the word "troublemaker" in red letters. Mrs. Pemberton arrived that afternoon with a delegation from the Ladies' Auxiliary, threatening to have Sarah's pension revoked entirely if she continued her inappropriate activities. "You're embarrassing the memory of your husband," Mrs. Pemberton declared. "Jack McLeod died a hero. How do you think he'd feel knowing his widow was making a public spectacle of herself?" Sarah's response would become legendary among the women who followed her, and mark the moment she truly found her voice as a leader. "Mrs. Pemberton," Sarah said, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "I knew Jack McLeod better than anyone. He was a man who stood up for what was right even when it was difficult. He died fighting against a system that treated people as expendable. If he were here today, he wouldn't be ashamed of me for fighting for justice. He'd be ashamed of a country that abandons the families of its heroes." The confrontation made the newspapers. "War Widow Defies Authority," read the headline in the Sydney Morning Herald. The article was meant to be critical, but it had an unexpected effect. It brought Sarah's cause to the attention of women across Australia who were facing the same struggles. Letters began arriving from war widows in Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth, and Adelaide. Each letter told a similar story of bureaucratic cruelty, inadequate pensions, and social isolation. But they also contained something else: hope and a willingness to fight. Within 6 months, the War Widows Association had chapters in every major Australian city. Sarah, now visibly pregnant and increasingly confident as a public speaker, traveled between cities organizing meetings, documenting cases of pension abuse, and building political pressure for reform. But it would be the birth of her son that would give Sarah the final piece of motivation she needed to win her greatest victory. John McLeod was born on March 15, 1916, exactly 8 months after his father's death at Hill 60. Sarah held her son for the first time in the same hospital where she had once taught expectant mothers about child care, and felt the full weight of her responsibility settle on her shoulders. This child would grow up without a father, but he would not grow up in a world where his mother was treated as a second-class citizen. This child would know that his father had died a hero, and that his mother had fought to ensure that heroism meant something. The War Widows Association's first major victory came in 1917, when the government agreed to reform the pension system, eliminating the discriminatory marriage requirements and increasing payments to a living wage. But Sarah wasn't finished. She pushed for job training programs for war widows, for child care support, for housing assistance. By 1918, when Tommy McLeod returned from Gallipoli carrying his brother's final letter, Sarah had become one of the most recognizable advocates for women's rights in Australia. She had testified before Parliament, organized protests that drew thousands of participants, and built a network of support that would outlast the war by decades. When Tommy came to her door carrying his guilt and his brother's words, Sarah saw not just Jack's brother, but a man who understood the cost of survival. Their courtship was slow and careful, built on shared grief and mutual respect. When they married in 1918, it wasn't to replace what Sarah had lost, but to build something new from the ashes of loss. Together, Sarah and Tommy raised John as their own son while having 3 more children. But Sarah never stopped her advocacy work. She served on government committees, helped establish the first women's shelters, and fought for voting rights, equal pay, and social justice until her death in 1967. At her funeral, hundreds of women gathered to honor the teacher who had become a warrior, the widow who had refused to disappear, the mother who had fought to ensure that no woman would face alone what she had faced. On her gravestone, beneath her name and dates, is an inscription that captures the essence of her life. She chose to fight. Sarah McLeod received the telegram about her husband's death on the same day she discovered she was pregnant. In that moment of devastating loss and miraculous hope, she made a choice that would echo through generations. She chose not to grieve quietly, but to fight loudly. She chose not to disappear, but to make herself impossible to ignore. And in making that choice, she ensured that Jack McLeod's death meant something more than just another casualty of war. It meant the beginning of a movement that would change the lives of countless women and prove that sometimes the greatest battles are fought not on foreign battlefields but in the quiet courage of those left behind.